and they put a rock against the tomb. The following day was the Sabbath, so the followers of Jesus, being practitioners, obviously, of the Jewish faith up until this point, observed the Sabbath. But then early on Sunday morning, some of the women followers came to visit the tomb, and they found it empty. They saw a visitation of a couple of angels who informed them that Jesus had actually risen from the dead. With this news, they told the disciples. A couple of the disciples came and examined the tomb as well. And eventually, Jesus will appear to a couple of his disciples who walked on a country road, and then to a group of disciples as they sat in the upper room. Luke's gospel ends by telling us that after this appearance to the disciples, Jesus ascended to heaven. But then the second volume, Acts of the Apostles, continues to tell us that Jesus actually appeared to his disciples over a period of 40 days. And of course, 50 days after the Passover, the occasion on when Jesus was said to have been crucified, we have Pentecost. And on that occasion, the disciples, together with many onlookers, received an extraordinary appearance. They received the infusion of the Holy Spirit. With that, they preached to the crowd about the fact of Jesus' resurrection, and many were converted on the spot. So now that's the broad outline. But then what are the details? We have not only Luke's gospel, but we have Matthew, Mark, and John. And Dr. Craig has told us that Mark was written first. Most scholars today will agree that Matthew and Luke actually copied from Mark. But they didn't just simply slavishly copied. They also made embellishments as they go. They added, they removed, or rather failed to mention, and they made improvements as they went. And as we study these Gospels in comparison with Mark, we will see the improvements that they made. In fact, this whole story that I've given you is only partially related in Mark. Mark actually stops at chapter 16, verse number 8, with the verse that Dr. Craig told us about, where the women fled from the tomb in fear and astonishment, and they said nothing to anybody because they were afraid. Now, many people obviously were not happy with this ending of Mark's gospel. This is how it appears in the oldest manuscripts that we have. So we also find some other endings floating around. There is a so-called longer ending, another so-called shorter ending, and then in a manuscript kept in a library in Washington called the Phreologion, named after the library, there is even an insertion into the longer ending. So you have Mark's gospel stopping at verse number 8, then you have another 12 verses tacked on in what is called the longer ending, verses 9 to 20. And within that those verses 9 to 20, you have a further insertion by somebody else in another variety of ending. And some manuscripts that did not have these endings have a shorter one, which just simply tells us in brief that these women did in fact go and relate everything to the disciples. So all of the appearances that are mentioned in Luke's gospel are in fact missing from Mark's gospel. All we have in Mark's gospel as it is now is a promise from a young man who the women saw at the tomb, who may be an angelic figure, but it's not specifically said so, who told them that Jesus is risen and they should tell his disciples to go to Galilee, for there they will see Jesus as he already told them. And that's it. The women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Obviously, people were not happy with that ending of Mark, and they tacked on additional endings to now tell us the same sorts of things which Luke's gospel tells us. The women went and told the story, and the disciples eventually see Jesus. Mark was not happy with Matthew was also not happy with Mark's ending. Neither was Luke. So if we have Mark as the source, and then we have Matthew and Luke borrowing from Mark, what did they do with that particular verse which says that the women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid? Luke has it that the women understood already what the whole score was. They knew everything about what Jesus had said previous to his crucifixion, how he said that he is actually going to go through all of this and eventually rise from the dead. And so they eventually went and told the disciples. That's how Luke rephrases that verse. What does Matthew do? Matthew tells us, quite contrary to Mark, that the women fled from the tomb with fear and great joy, and they ran to tell the disciples. So you have a continuity with Mark's wording, but also a diversion from it and towards a new meaning. Now, Matthew has it that, in fact, the women, on their way to tell the disciples, actually meet Jesus. So you can see a development in the story, whereas in Mark's gospel, all they ever saw was a young man who may be an angel, but not necessarily so. Now in Matthew, he is definitely an angel, explicitly said to be so. He tells the women. And the women not only go to tell Jesus about what some angel said, but in fact, they can actually report now that they met Jesus themselves. Now, the message of the angel in Mark's gospel was tell the disciples to go to Galilee. There they will see Jesus as he told them, meaning that Jesus had already told them this. And this is Jesus' message that the angel is giving to them. But in Matthew's gospel, the wording of the angel is changed. And scholars believe that the wording in Matthew's gospel is to make room for the fact that Jesus himself will appear to the women and he himself will tell them to tell the disciples to go to Galilee. So in Matthew's gospel, the angel actually tells them that I have told you. Not that this is Jesus' message to you, this is my message to you, because Jesus will give his own message. If the wordings of angels can be changed like this, then one wonders what else might have been changed. But if we ask about the substantial fact of where Jesus appeared and to whom and when, we can find no corroborating evidence from one gospel to another. Let's look at what happens. So let's go back to Luke's gospel again. Luke's gospel has the disciples seeing visitations of Jesus in and around Jerusalem. And that continues into Acts of the Apostles. And in Luke's gospel, Jesus, when he visits them, tells them specifically, you should stay in Jerusalem until that which has been promised will come to pass. And this is an obvious reference to the event of Pentecost. So they stay in Jerusalem, obviously, if they follow Jesus' command. But that's a very different and contrary command to the one given in Mark's gospel, that they're to go to Galilee, and in Matthew's gospel, that they're to go to Galilee. Either they're to go to Galilee to see Jesus, or they're going to remain in Jerusalem to see Jesus right here. Some scholars try to dovetail the various reports in order to make them fit together. Somebody may suggest, for example, that Jesus went to Galilee, he saw them there, then came back to Jerusalem and saw them there as well, or they saw him. But as James Dunn, a reputable New Testament scholar, has put it, this actually is not possible because given the distance, it will take too much time to go to Galilee and come back to appear, not that it will take Jesus that much time, but it will take the disciples so much time to go to Galilee and come back to be there on Easter Sunday to see visitations of Jesus in Jerusalem. Raymond Brown as well, who according to Dr. Craig is one of the greatest New Testament scholars of our present time, actually says that to do it this way does violence to the textual material. It does not really allow for that. Now, we didn't say anything about John's gospel yet, but let's say something about that. I've already said that according to Luke's gospel, Jesus appeared on Easter Sunday to his disciples when they were in the upper room. And Luke specifically says that there were 11 disciples. John's gospel has it that Jesus did appear to his disciples on that occasion. He doesn't tell us the number of them. But he tells us that a week later, Jesus appeared when Thomas was present, with the clear implication and the clear statement that Thomas was absent on the first occasion, which means that there were only 10 disciples. Now, were there 10 or were there 11? According to Luke, there were 11. According to John, only 10.